For nearly half a century, Cyprus has been cut in two. In the north, the Turkish Cypriot government, and in the south, the Republic of Cyprus, Greek-speaking and Christian. Varosha, a former seaside resort and a symbol of the island's division, became a ghost town when it was abandoned by its inhabitants following the Turkish invasion in 1974. In 2019, Turkey reopened Varosha to tourists and to former residents. Long deprived of their right to return, they are now demanding the return of their property.
C'est moi qui me bats pour l'instant, mais je sais pas combien d'années je peux encore me battre.
Watch Varosha Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Join us every day here on France 24 for the last stretch of the presidential race, the mother of all election, the presidential election. This is the time for the French to choose their president. We'll have all our special envoys on the campaign trail across the globe, the latest analysis, the best polls. Join us here on France 24.
France 2022, the campaign, on France 24 and France24.com.
This is live from Paris. It's 8 p.m. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson, and these are the headlines. As Russia continues to pound the Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv and Mariupol, NATO holds talks to discuss next steps, and the UK and the US unveil fresh sanctions. A military court in Burkina Faso hands a life sentence to the former president Blaise Compaoré over the assassination of the revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara back in 1987. And with just 4 days to go until round one of France's presidential election, one issue that just won't go away is the use of management consultants by President Macron's government. Let's begin on the ground in Ukraine, where Russian artillery has today continued to pound the city of Kharkiv in the northeast and the port city of Mariupol in the south. Well, the Ukrainian authorities say that Russia may soon launch a full-blown assault to try to take Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second largest city. Well, in Mariupol, the humanitarian situation is reported to be worsening as tens of thousands of people are trapped with very limited access to food, water or power. Well, since pulling back from areas surrounding Kyiv last week, Russian forces are shifting their assault towards the south and the east of the country. Meanwhile, it emerged today that Russian forces had struck a fuel depot near the central Ukrainian city of Dnipro overnight, resulting in a massive blaze, which took 8 hours to extinguish. Well, Dnipro's airport was destroyed by Russian strikes last month. Well, let's bring in our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons, who is in the west of Ukraine, in the border city of Lviv, who joins us now. Rob, concerns that Russia may soon be beefing up their efforts in the east of the country. What's the latest you're hearing?
Well, that certainly seems to be the way things are going at the moment. The Ukrainian government has been warning that that's going to happen for some time now. Western intelligence has also spoken of a redeployment of Russian troops away from the northwest of Kiev and from the east of Kiev to the east of the country, around the Donbass area, where it's assumed that the Russians are looking for a relatively easy victory in eastern Ukraine, that perhaps by Victory Day on May the 9th in Russia, Vladimir Putin will be able to trumpet a victory of sorts to the Russian people. But certainly today, the alarm bells seem to be ringing a bit louder in Ukraine. The deputy vice, or the vice premier, warning, or urging rather, people living in the east of the country, in the Donbass, to evacuate as fast as possible. And today, you spoke about the rocket attacks, the artillery attacks on Kharkiv, but there were also attacks on the cities, the towns of the Donbass as well. Donetsk, for instance, in the northern part of Luhansk province, which is already largely taken by the Russians, was subjected to a pretty intensive artillery strike, some 10 multi-story buildings set on fire. And what the government is saying now is get out while you can, get out as fast as you can. This is the first time that the Ukrainian government has issued a warning like that, and one has to assume that what they've got in mind is what happened in those towns, those satellite towns around Kiev, like Bucha and Irpin, and they don't want to see the same thing happening again if Russian troops manage to capture, move into those towns in Luhansk and Donetsk provinces.
And I can see that you're in the centre of the city of Lviv right now as you're talking to us. Just tell us what's happening in that part of the country.
Well, you know, the extraordinary thing about being in Lviv at the moment is that you hardly feel that you're in a war at all. If it weren't for the sandbanks you see around key buildings and windows blacked out, you wouldn't think you were in a city that was in a country that was under attack by an invading army. Lviv is lively, the streets are full of people. It's certainly also the case that the population has been increased by 30% because of the refugees or the IDPs, the internally displaced people who have come from other parts of the country. But otherwise, in Lviv itself, the situation remains pretty calm at the moment. All the restaurants, cafes, bars open, people out serenading in the streets. You know, it's a beautiful sunny day today. But obviously there is tension. There's a curfew which comes into place in about 50 minutes from now. But it was interesting, you know, coming across the border today from Poland into Ukraine, not that many people fleeing the country at the moment. There was a queue maybe of about 100 people trying to get out of the country. But if you think back to about 3 weeks ago, the queue was stretching kilometers back from that border point. Today, scarcely anybody there at all. So the situation, for the moment at least, has changed. That may, of course, be a little bit different in 2 or 3 days from now if, as the government is appealing, for people to move from the eastern part of the country, to evacuate their houses in the Donbass. If they start moving into the west of Ukraine, the situation in places like Lviv, where I am now, could change rapidly.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for bringing us the latest there. Our Chief Foreign Editor, Rob Parsons. Thank you very much indeed. NATO foreign ministers began 2 days of talks in Brussels today to discuss next steps regarding the situation in Ukraine. All NATO allies have supplied Ukraine with key weaponry, including anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, which have helped Ukraine and its forces to push back the invading Russian forces. Well, Kyiv, meanwhile, is asking for heavier weaponry. The NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg said today that the conflict had reached what he called now a critical phase as Moscow moves its forces out of the north of Ukraine and repositions them in the east of the country. Well, Stoltenberg also said this conflict could last for many months or even years. Well, he took the opportunity to hail the strength of the NATO alliance and the leadership that's been offered to it by the United States. Here's what he said.
The US leadership has been outstanding and is indispensable. And that is of great importance when we face a very dangerous situation with the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I look forward to sit down with you, with the other foreign ministers in NATO, and to discuss a wide range of issues today and tomorrow, of course including Ukraine, but also that we are able to sit down with our Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Korea.
The NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, is speaking there. Well, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is also there in Brussels. Here's what he said about what Washington is seeking to achieve.
We set out to do three things if Russia decided to pursue this horrific aggression against Ukraine. One was to support our Ukrainian partners. We're doing that. Two was to put extraordinary pressure on Russia. We're doing that. Three was to make sure that we were shoring up the defenses of our own alliance, NATO, and we're doing that. And today, tomorrow, we'll continue to talk about not only how we can sustain these efforts, but how we can build upon them.
The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking there. Well, the US and the UK both announced new sanctions targeting Russia today. These latest punitive measures will target Russian financial institutions, as well as Kremlin officials and their family members. Washington measures include banning new investment in Russia, sanctioning President Putin's adult children, and family members of the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov. Meanwhile, the UK sanctioned 2 Russian banks and vowed to eliminate all Russian oil and gas imports by the end of this year. Turning our eyes to some other world news now, a military court in Burkina Faso has today handed down a life prison term to the country's former president, Blaise Compaoré, who was tried in absentia. This over the assassination of the revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara back in 1987. Well, applause erupted in the courtroom as that verdict was announced, bringing this 6-month-long trial to an end. Well, the legal proceedings have been very closely followed there in Burkina Faso, where Sankara's death remains a very raw issue, even 34 years after the event. Well, the former President Blaise Compaoré, who was ousted in 2014, lives in exile in Ivory Coast. Well, let's get some more analysis. Our international affairs editor, Philip Turl, joins us now. Philip, welcome to you. Help us understand, why is it taking quite so long for justice to be delivered?
Well, if you cast your mind back to 1987 and that fateful day on the 15th of October when Thomas Sankara was gunned down, he was formerly a close friend of Blaise Compaoré, and the two men fell out over the way the revolution of Burkina Faso was unfolding over the time that Thomas Sankara was president. He was quite well respected around Africa. They were calling him the Che Guevara of the African continent. He was well known for being one of the first presidents to fight against HIV and AIDS and underline how serious that was in the country, to bring down wages of government officials so that to be more money available for poorer people in the country. So he was seen really as a bit like the Robin Hood of the African continent. But this didn't go down well with some of his colleagues in the regime, and that led to him being assassinated on that day. And of course, since Blaise Compaoré, who took power after that, was in control of the country for so long, it became a taboo subject about what actually happened to Thomas Sankara, who was involved in his assassination, why he was shot dead. It's only since Blaise Compaoré himself was toppled that the process has got underway to find out what happened and to bring those responsible to justice. So we've got today this historic ruling in Burkina Faso where Blaise Compaoré, the former president, has been found guilty and given a lifetime sentence in absentia, because as you said, he's in Ivory Coast. Two other people who were also given long sentences, life sentences. One was Hyacinth Kafando, who was the head of security and was in charge of overseeing the assassination of Thomas Sankara. That's according to witness reports. And a third one is Gilbert Diendéré, who was the man who gave the orders to carry out the assassination of Thomas Sankara. He's also been given a life sentence. So this is a major victory for the people of Burkina Faso. And I think that if you compare to what we were talking about yesterday, the situation in Darfur, where it's taken years and years and years to get at least one person responsible to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, that's basically because the former president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, just refused to cooperate. And it's what we've seen going on in Burkina Faso over all these years. And now, because there's been a change of regime, that means that those who have been involved in assassinations and dirty tricks in the old days can be at last brought to justice.
And just tell us why it is, and this trial it's being so closely watched in Burkina Faso. Clearly, very important to people there.
Well, I think there are at least two or three reasons. The first one is that this is vindicating Thomas Sankara and bringing justice to the people who were related to him. His wife Mariam, for example, was there at the court when the verdict was given. So at last, those who were close associated with Thomas Sankara can say justice has been done. His body's never been found. They have not even got a grave they can go to mourn his death. So I think on that front, that is good news. The second point is that this is very important for Burkina Faso as a way of bringing the country back together and helping it get over this dark period in its history where a former leader was assassinated and justice was never done. And there's been a big division in the country between those who agree with Blaise Compaoré and those who don't. And I think that the fact that this court case has gone ahead, people have been found guilty, sentences have been handed down even in absentia, will in a way help heal the wounds that have been left behind by this assassination over so many years.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for your analysis. Our international affairs editor, Philip Turl. Thank you. The World Health Organization says that for a second consecutive week, the number of COVID-19 cases across the globe has fallen. The number of confirmed COVID deaths has also dropped during the last week. However, in China, it's a different story. Shanghai remains under lockdown, and the authorities are doing mass testing. Well, despite growing public frustration, Beijing is sticking to its zero-tolerance approach to containing the virus. France 24's Jenny Shin has more.
Queues continued to grow by the hour at COVID testing centers in Shanghai, as the city reported more than 20,000 new COVID cases on Wednesday, a record high since the start of the pandemic. A setback for China's zero-COVID strategy, but authorities do not intend to give it up just yet.
The most pressing task for us is to ramp up measures on transport and isolation. Once new positive cases are detected, they must be transferred to designated hospitals for immediate isolation to receive timely treatment without delay.
The inhabitants of the largest city in the country have been forced to stay at home since the measures came into effect 1 week ago. But Shanghai is taking no chances. To contain the outbreak, authorities have built this makeshift isolation facility with a capacity of more than 40,000 beds. All those who have tested positive, including asymptomatic patients, must check in. To run the operation, thousands of medical personnel from other parts of China have been deployed to the site.
The country has already sent medical teams, mostly to temporary hospitals, from other provinces to aid Shanghai. The first batch of medical workers and sample collectors from Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Anhui provinces have already arrived in Shanghai.
Meanwhile, patience is wearing thin among the city's residents in the face of strict restrictions, which have led to panic buying of basic goods, as well as a shortage of delivery drivers to bring food to the millions at home indoors.
Well, up next, it is France 2022, The Campaign, our daily show presented by Mark Perlman.
Welcome to France 2022, The Campaign. It is our daily show covering the presidential race and only 4 days to go before round one. So on the menu tonight, the far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon wants to channel angry voters, while Marine Le Pen is urging everyone to be protected by her, and Maverick Jean Lassalle campaigns in favor of a blank vote. Shirley Sitban has the story.
Jean-Luc Mélenchon has already made a breakthrough in polls. He has now multiplied himself. The far-left candidate and his trademark holograms held rallies in 12 cities, with a special message aiming those planning to vote for Marine Le Pen, his main rival.
Écoutez vous autres, les fâchés qui n'êtes pas fachos. À la fin, où ça vous mène cette histoire d'essayer de porter cette femme au pouvoir? Où y trouvez-vous quoi que ce soit dans ce qu'elle dit ou ce qu'elle fait qui ne soit pas entièrement teinté d'une sorte de mépris de classe?
Contempt? Perhaps a lack of consideration? Public TV station France 2 feels that is how it's been treated by President Emmanuel Macron, who has snubbed its political shows.
J'avais une question à vous poser d'abord, savoir si vous aviez des nouvelles de Macron. Parce qu'on pensait qu'il serait là.
After one of his trademark punchlines targeting Macron, Philippe Poutou sniped at Éric Zemmour.
Il nous reste 2 minutes de temps de parole avant d'accueillir Éric Zemmour qui se prépare en coulisses et qui va prendre la suite.
Vous parlez du fasciste raciste qui est accusé d'agression sexuelle?
Zemmour is used to those types of attacks, just like Mélenchon. Le Pen targeted both of them in one go.
On a deux candidats qui sont hémiplégiques. Il y en a un qui ne parle que de protection sociale et l'autre qui ne parle que de protection civilisationnelle. Et moi, précisément, je suis la candidate de toutes les protections.
Jean Lassalle tries to remain optimistic, but even he realizes he won't be dancing on election night. Throughout the campaign, Lassalle said his goal is to bring power back to the people.
Et la meilleure manière de le faire, c'est de comptabiliser complètement et de tenir compte absolument du vote blanc. Ce qui fait que dimanche prochain, compte tenu de ce que je vois et de ce que j'entends dans la campagne, c'est Monsieur Blanc qui serait en tête.
That is all from the campaign trail. Meet again tomorrow, same time.
Okay, a wrap there of the day. Well, one issue that won't go away is the controversy surrounding the use of American management consultancy firms by the Macron administration, in particular McKinsey, Mark.
Yes, absolutely. Today, the National Financial Prosecutor's Office announced that it had opened a preliminary probe into potential tax fraud by McKinsey. This comes after a Senate report claimed that the company had not paid taxes in France over the past decade, prompting furious calls by the opposition that Macron was in cahoots with McKinsey. Let's listen to the reaction of Conservative candidate Valérie Pécresse and the reply from the government spokesman Gabriel Attal.
It's a scandal that a company that receives hundreds of millions of euros in public orders can go and make a false declaration to the Senate saying that it pays its taxes in France. Yes, it's a false declaration on oath, so it's normal for a probe to be launched.
From the start, we've called for truth to come out on the tax practices of this consultancy group. And it's based on this that from the month of December, a set of tax investigations were initiated by the Finance Ministry. Let me restate what the Finance Minister has already said. This consultancy firm will pay everything it has to pay.
OK, well, let's move on from talking about McKinsey to talking about how the candidates are doing in the polls. Another IFOP poll is out. What does it show about the first round, Mark?
Emmanuel Macron still ahead, 27%. Marine Le Pen still on the rise, 23.5%. Jean-Luc Mélenchon also 1 percentage point up, 17.5%. While Valérie Pécresse, who we just saw, and Éric Zemmour on the far right are now at 9%. They appear really to be out of the race.
OK, so the race looking tight at the top end anyway. And what about the second round, Mark?
Also getting tighter, 52.5% for Emmanuel Macron, 47.5% from Marine Le Pen. It has never been as tight between both of them in 2017. 64% Macron, 36% Le Pen.
OK, well, let's try to look ahead at the predicted round two face-off between Macron and Le Pen and how voters will vote for the eliminated candidates. How will that change the balance in the second round?
This is the key to the Élysée. You know, they will not get enough votes in the first round to be elected in the second round, so they need other votes. And we looked at some of the figures. Many of those voters will be undecided, maybe will not go to the ballot box. However, if you look at those who are going to cast a ballot for far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon, in the second round, it's interesting, most of them would vote for Macron, but still, over a third would go for Marine Le Pen. And if you look at the electorate of the conservative candidate Valérie Pécresse, it's even more striking. Only a slight majority would vote in favor of Emmanuel Macron. And that's a sea change, because for a far-left voter or for a conservative voter, voting for Marine Le Pen was something they could not fathom in the past. And now, clearly, this is changed, and this is why the race is so tight this year.
OK, well, let's continue looking at the far right. So there's Marine Le Pen, there's Éric Zemmour. They're the two main candidates, perhaps the best known. But there is another candidate in the race, Mark.
Yes, his name is Nicolas Dupont-Aignan. He's running for the third time. Back in 2017, he scored an honorable 4.7%. This year, he's struggling, around 2% in the polls. Clovis Casali is at his campaign rally in Paris. Clovis, how can you exist between Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour?
Well, that's the question. It was hard enough to exist when there was just Marine Le Pen. But now that you've also got Éric Zemmour on the French far right, well, it's very difficult for Nicolas Dupont-Aignan. This is his final rally before the first round of the presidential election. And he's recruited a man called Florian Philippot. For those who follow French politics, they might remember Florian Philippot from his days at the Front National and Rassemblement National. He was the right-hand man of Marine Le Pen. And Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, the candidate of Rise Up France, actually joined forces with Marine Le Pen back in 2017 for the second round of the presidential election. If she was elected president, he would become the prime minister. So now it's really difficult for Nicolas Dupont-Aignan to actually exist. In the polls, he's only got about 2% of the vote. But he is trying to appear as different, and he has got very different proposals and ideas in his manifesto. For one, he wants a Frexit. He wants France to leave the European Union with a slogan you might have heard many times in the past, notably in the United Kingdom, with "Take Back Control." That's Nicolas Dupont-Agnan's dream. He wants to get back the money from Europe, stop giving billions to Europe and instead give them to the pensioners here in France. We heard some very harsh words tonight from Nicolas Dupont-Aignan saying that basically the Élysée had killed French people with its policies during the COVID-19 crisis, and that Emmanuel Macron, well, there was a conflict of interest with big companies like Pfizer. Nicolas Dupont-Aignan said France needed to clean up the whole of the political scene and clean up the Élysée Palace. Earlier, I spoke to some of the Nicolas Dupont-Aignan supporters and asked them, why are you choosing Dupont-Aignan and not Éric Zemmour or Marine Le Pen? Take a listen.
Je ne trouve pas qu'il y ait vraiment de programme identique. Je pense que Marine Le Pen, comme M. Zemmour, ont copié le programme de Nicolas Dupont-Aignan. Donc ce n'est pas lui qui s'est adapté à leur programme, ce sont les autres qui ont pris les meilleures choses du programme.
Bah, regardez le programme de Mme Le Pen et le programme de Dupont-Aignan, il n'y a pas de similitude. Pour le pass vaccinal, qu'est-ce qu'elle fera? On n'en sait rien. Elle ne veut plus sortir de l'Europe.
Okay, good to get the voices of some voters there. Thank you very much indeed to you, Clovis Casselli in central Paris. Thank you very much indeed. I'm here in the studio by France 24. We're joined by France 24 reporter Claire Pacalin. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Claire, healthcare is an issue where there seems to be some consensus. It doesn't happen that often among the candidates.
Yeah, for once, we have the candidates actually agreeing on a few things, which is nice. When it comes to healthcare, I mean, it would be politically disastrous for a candidate to come out and say they want to take money away from the public healthcare system. And that's interesting because in previous elections, particularly on the right, there was a lot of talk about France's healthcare system being too wasteful, inefficient, and need to cut back, reduce the size of it. This time, of course, we've had COVID-19, we've had this big pandemic, and that really exposed a lot of problems in the healthcare system. Personnel who were overworked, bad working conditions, exhaustion among some of the nurses and health assistants and doctors. So now we do finally have some kind of consensus with the candidates not daring to say that they wouldn't recruit any more health assistants or nurses. On the contrary, all the candidates are saying that they want to recruit more staff for hospitals.
Okay, just tell us a little bit more about some of the messages coming from the candidates.
So what's interesting is that while they all agree that there needs to be more nurses and health assistants in hospitals, the numbers differ widely. We have Valérie Pécresse, the right-wing candidate. She's saying, well, she promises if she were to be elected, 25,000 new nurses and health assistants. If we go slightly more into the centre, then we're going to have Macron saying 50,000 if he were to get another 5 years in power. And then we go Yannick Jadot, he's the Green, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, far left, Fabienne Roussel, communist. They are saying 100,000 nurses and health assistants are needed. And then we go all the way over to Philippe Poutou, the Trotskyist, and he's saying 200,000 new nurses and health assistants are needed. So they do agree on the general principle, but obviously not on the numbers.
We're also hearing the candidates talk a lot about the so-called medical deserts.
Yes, the medical deserts. This is what the French call the uneven distribution of doctors, and specifically GPs or family doctors, the first port of call for patients. You go to the south of France, you're looking at 120 doctors for 100,000 people. Some parts of the country, it's not even half that amount. I recently filmed a report with Pauline Godard from France 24's French channel, and we visited a medical desert just outside Paris, Livry-Gargan, and we met with a doctor there who's 74. He's still practicing because he hasn't got anyone to replace him, so he can't bear to retire and abandon his patients. And we met some of his patients too who are now desperately looking for a new doctor, and they can't find one because he has finally said that this year, when he turns 74, he will retire. I think we can take a listen now to some of the report that I filmed with Pauline Godard.
On a peu de médecins qui s'établissent maintenant, c'est un désert médical.
Et le fait que le docteur Whelan va plus pouvoir à un moment vous suivre, ça m'angoisse.
Les gens me disent, docteur, vous êtes encore au travail? Ça fait déjà 3 fois que vous dites que vous partiez à la retraite. Et je repousse, vous voyez ce que je veux dire? Donc c'est que ma meilleure façon de ne pas angoisser, c'est de continuer à travailler. Mais un jour, il faudra quand même, 74 ans, il faudra quand même que je passe la main aux autres.
OK, well, that's where we're going to have to leave you. Thank you very much, Claire Pagalin. Thanks for that. And to our French politics editor, Mark Perelman. That's it for this edition of France 2022, The Campaign.
War has once more reared its head in Europe, recalling the darkest hours of our history.
Kiev is still about 30 kilometers away.
France 24 is providing constant coverage of events in Ukraine. Our teams on the ground and in the studio will keep you informed of all the latest developments. Stay informed, stay aware.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
This is live from Paris. It's 8:30 p.m. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson, and these are the headlines. As Russia continues to pound the Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv and Mariupol, NATO is holding talks to discuss next steps, and the UK and the US have unveiled fresh sanctions. A military court in Burkina Faso hands a life sentence to the former president Blaise Compaoré over the assassination of the revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara back in 1987. And human rights groups accuse Ethiopian forces of committing abuses against the Tigrayan people. Abuses, they say, amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Welcome back. We begin on the ground in Ukraine, where Russian artillery has today continued to pound the city of Kharkiv in the northeast and the port city of Mariupol in the south. Well, in Mariupol, the humanitarian situation is reported to be getting worse as tens of thousands of people remain trapped there with limited access to food, water or electricity. Well, since pulling back from areas surrounding Kyiv last week, Russian forces are shifting their focus to the south and the east of the country, and fears are growing in the Donbass region that a Russian invasion could be imminent. Well, France 24's Sharon Gaffney has this report for us.
Before being destroyed by local troops, this bridge was the only way to access the village of Bogorodich in eastern Ukraine. Since Moscow announced its intention to focus on what it called the liberation of the Donbass, residents in the traditional mining region have been living in constant fear of an assault.
Ну, в данный момент, конечно, все напряженные, все в ожидании чего-то, можно сказать. А чего, сами никто не знает. Очень много стариков.
With the front line just a few kilometres away, Russian troops are approaching the area from the north. Roadblocks have been set up around these villages as part of efforts to slow the progress of Russian tanks. Ukrainian troops say they're prepared and braced for an attack.
Тому як Російсько-фашистська федерація зайшла на нашу святу українську землю з мечом, від меча тут всі і загинуть.
The war has already reached this village, the roof of this monastery among the buildings damaged by explosions. Sviatorysk is just 45 kilometers north of the strategic town of Slivobask. Ukrainian forces have been deployed in the area since 2014.
12 апреля был захвачен Славянск группой российских спецпризначенцев, и по имеющейся информации они хотят годовщину этого мероприятия захватить к этому времени Славянск.
Amid fears that a Russian offensive may be imminent, thousands of civilians are attempting to flee westwards from the region each day.
Meanwhile, NATO foreign ministers began 2 days of talks in Brussels today to discuss next steps regarding the situation in Ukraine. Well, NATO allies have supplied Ukraine with key weaponry, including anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, which have helped Ukrainian forces to push back at the invading Russian troops. Well, Kyiv, meanwhile, is asking for heavier weaponry. Well, the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg said today the conflict has reached what he called a critical phase as Moscow moves its forces out of the north of the country and repositions them in the east and of the country for a major offensive there. Well, Stoltenberg also said this conflict could last many months, even years. And he also took the opportunity to hail the strength of the NATO alliance and the leadership being offered by the United States.
The US leadership has been outstanding and is indispensable. And that is of great importance when we face a very dangerous situation with the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I look forward to sit down with you, with the other foreign ministers in NATO, and to discuss a wide range of issues today and tomorrow, of course including Ukraine, but also that we are able to sit down with our Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Korea.
Jens Stoltenberg standing alongside the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Brussels. Well, here's what Blinken said about what Washington is seeking to achieve.
We set out to do three things if Russia decided to pursue this horrific aggression against Ukraine. One was to support our Ukrainian partners. We're doing that. Two was to put extraordinary pressure on Russia. We're doing that. Three was to make sure that we were shoring up the defenses of our own alliance, NATO, and we're doing that. And today, tomorrow, we'll continue to talk about not only how we can sustain these efforts, but how we can build upon them.
Antony Blinken speaking there in Brussels. Well, let's cross to France 24's Dave Keating in Brussels to get the latest. Dave, not just NATO members present there at that two-day summit. There are some special guest attendees. Just tell us who else is there and why they're there.
Yeah, there are essentially three groups of non-NATO members at this summit taking place right now in Brussels. One is the EU, which has been participating in NATO summits almost as if it was a member for the past month. And in that same category is Sweden and Finland. They are EU members, but they are not NATO members. However, there is increasing speculation that they are preparing to join NATO and renounce their decades-old neutrality. Then the other category is Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. They're there because Secretary General Stoltenberg wants NATO to have an increasing focus on China. He's mentioned China several times over the past 2 days, saying that Russia and China together are challenging the global world order and that NATO needs to confront China head on as a possible threat with possible security implications for those Pacific nations. And of course, the big fear is that China might aid Russia in the Ukraine war. But that is a controversial idea because French President Emmanuel Macron said 2 weeks ago that he doesn't think the North Atlantic Treaty Organization should be focused on the Pacific. Then finally, the third category is the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Georgia. They are obviously there for security guarantees from NATO. We know that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has ruled out NATO membership as part of these negotiations with Russia. He said that that's now off the table in an effort to try to reach a peace deal with Russia. Nonetheless, they are there still looking for some kind of security guarantee and help from NATO countries.
And Dave, one request we've heard time and time again from Ukraine is for more weaponry, in particular heavier weaponry. Is there any chance of that request being met?
This is going to be a big discussion over the next 2 days because the issue has been pushed today by the Czech Republic, which announced that it is sending tanks over to Ukraine. As I understand it, those tanks are on their way right now. That would be the first time that a NATO country is sending heavy military machinery to Ukraine. It represents a big crossing of a line here. When asked about it coming into the NATO summit today, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg didn't really want to discuss what type of arms they might be sending. He wanted to focus on the type of arms they've already been sending. But it's possible that by the end of the day yesterday, we'll have more NATO countries saying that they're going to send heavy military equipment like tanks over to Ukraine. There are going to be other NATO members that worry that that's going to escalate the situation, and they're also going to worry about the safety of that equipment as it makes its way over to Ukraine. Czech Republic does not border Ukraine. Those tanks will have a long way to go, and there is a lot of anxiety about whether Russia would attack those supply lines of heavy military equipment as they make their way to Ukraine, and that would be within NATO territory, which of course could spark humongous worldwide conflict between Russia and NATO. So that'll be a big point of discussion over the next 2 days, and definitely triggered to be more of a discussion by this Czech decision today.
Okay, Dave Keating in Brussels, thank you very much indeed for bringing us all the latest there. A military court in Burkina Faso has today handed down a life prison term to the country's former president, Blaise Compaoré, who was tried in absentia. This over the assassination of the revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara back in 1987. Well, applause erupted in the courtroom as that verdict was announced, bringing this 6-month-long trial to an end. Well, Compaoré, who was ousted in 2014, lives in exile in Ivory Coast. Well, the legal proceedings have been very closely watched there in Burkina Faso, where Sankara's death remains a very raw issue. Well, France 24's Peter O'Brien takes a closer look now at just who Sankara was.
He was one of the most popular African leaders of the last 40 years. Thomas Sankara was born in 1949 in the north of Burkina Faso, then known as Upper Volta. He trained at a military academy in Madagascar. In 1984, following a coup led by Blaise Compaoré, he was named president of Burkina Faso. He was a charismatic left-wing president and a feminist.
Ce qui veut dire que nous devons donner à chaque femme un emploi. Nous devons donner à chaque femme le moyen de gagner honnêtement et dignement sa vie.
Sankara was opposed to poor countries paying back their debts to Western nations, and he promoted vast vaccination campaigns and debates.
Seul le débat contradictoire permanent peut nous mettre sur la brèche et nous obliger à regarder de très près ce que désirent les masses, et non pas les images classiques, académiques que nous recherchons pour nous donner bonne conscience ou pour être simplement en conformité avec un Occident qui nous a inculqué des méthodes, des façons de voir.
At times he was authoritarian. The population was controlled by so-called committees for the defense of the revolution. After only 3 years as president, he was assassinated. Blaise Compaoré then seized power. He was toppled nearly 3 decades later in 2014 and fled to Côte d'Ivoire.
Now, according to 2 rights groups, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, security forces and their allies have committed abuses against the Tigrayan people in northern Ethiopia. Abuses, they say, amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Well, their harrowing report says that Tigrayan civilians have been relentlessly targeted since the outbreak of Ethiopia's war back in November 2020 and subjected to extrajudicial killings, torture and sexual violence.
Atrocities that amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The words from a new report by the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International revealing harrowing abuses of civilians in the western Ethiopian region of Tigray.
The Amhara forces, including the Amhara Special Forces and the Fano militia, committed ethnic cleansing of West Tigray to drive Tigrayans out of West Tigray, through a variety of crimes amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity.
The investigation is a culmination of hundreds of interviews with refugees and local witnesses, documenting human rights abuses in the war. Since the conflict broke out in 2020, Tigray People's Liberation Front have been fighting against the Ethiopian National Defense Force, which have partnered with troops from the Amhara region. According to the joint report, several 100,000 Tigrayans have since been forcibly expelled from their homes by military forces and subjected to widespread abuse, including torture, mass executions and rape. To this day, tens of thousands of Tigrayans remain locked up in overcrowded detention centers, many in life-threatening conditions due to abuse and starvation. Both rights groups have also accused Amhara forces of denying humanitarian assistance to the region, calling for the deployment of a peacekeeping force led by the African Union to ensure civilian protection. The report has been 15 months in the making, due to Ethiopian authorities keeping out journalists and humanitarian organizations, and security forces killing on sight those crossing the border with Sudan to prevent information leaks.
Okay, up next here on France 24, it is Truth or Fake, our daily fact-checking segment. In association with the France 24 Observers, I'm here with James Creedon. Hello, James.
Hi, Tom.
Now, let's begin by looking at the pro-Russian Twitter accounts that you've been sharing, you've been looking at, because they share images claiming that the recent massacre in Bucha was either staged or exaggerated. What have you got?
Right, well, it's more further examples, Tom, of the waters being muddied around what's going on the ground here in Ukraine. And the Observers team have been looking at 3 examples where the massacre that took place on the 3rd of April, Russian soldiers in Bucha having sort of seized this territory near Kiev, a terrible massacre having taken place. Pretty much all of the reporting on the ground affirming that that has happened. And there are examples swirling around social media on pro-Russian accounts claiming that at least some of that, if not all of it, is fabricated. Now, so the first example we're going to look at is this one here. Now, that's a still from a video and shared on this Twitter account. It's saying, what's this all about? Why are Ukrainian soldiers repositioning bodies like this? And what you can see actually is there is a body and it is being dragged along by a cable. If you do a reverse image search to bring us back to the origins of that video, the video is kind of stalling here on the AP website, but it's a video that was filmed by AP journalists on the 2nd of April. And if you look at the details of that video and the text, in fact, that they shared, the facts here are that there was a fear that these bodies that were killed by Russian soldiers in Bucha might have been booby-trapped. And what you had is Ukrainian soldiers going in there to clear away what was going on, or the bodies rather, and you had this particular detail that was noted by the AP journalists. Ukrainian soldiers, backed by a column of tanks and armoured vehicles, attached cables to the bodies, pulled them off the streets, fearing that they may be booby-trapped with explosive devices. This is war. This is the kind of horrible stuff that can happen. And that scene is a still from Ukrainian soldiers clearing bodies off the streets of Bucha out of the fear that in going towards those bodies, there could be a further assault on Ukrainian soldiers. Now, it's very easy to see how that can be misconstrued and how a cable dragging a body along could be presented or represented as staging an event, a sort of an elaborate mise en scène to create the illusion that this massacre was invented.
And that's certainly one of the claims that these pro-Putin apologists put up on their Twitter feed. Right. Now you've got an example involving a plastic mannequin. Again, I think I can see where this is headed.
All right, and this, we see fake news stories a lot involving plastic mannequins. There's actually, I suppose, there were examples in the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And indeed, in this particular tweet here, what you see is a person in French mentioning the COVID-19 pandemic, then saying, look, here we have further false deaths being associated with this war. Several weeks and months ago, we were showing images of hospital drills where mannequins were being used. The details of that can be found on our website. But in this particular case here, you can see a plastic mannequin. And again, you can see how perhaps a naive person just taking this at face value would think that this is a staging of deaths associated with the massacre in Bucha. Now, if you go to the actual facts, or again, reverse image search the video, it's a video that was published on the 3rd of April, rather, And the details of this particular video, if you take it back to the TikTok account from which it originated, is that this is a scene from a series that was being filmed in St. Petersburg. So actually the audio on this is in Russian as well. And the actor in question is a guy by the name of Filip Fedorchuk, and his Twitter, his TikTok account, you can see it here, has a whole, you can see that's the video I was talking about in question, right? So it appears on his TikTok account, and he has a whole range of other videos showing plastic mannequins and whatnot. He's been filming, according to his Instagram accounts, 2 series recently, Admirals of the District 2 and Conditional Cop, both of them in St. Petersburg. So there you go. That was a scene filmed in Russia, and it's being misconstrued by some on social media, saying that it's more filming of fake deaths in this instance related to the war. You can see that in French there, the faux morts de la guerre. So another example of how images are being misconstrued and misrepresented to magic up a faked massacre.
Well, it's totally sick when you consider there are enormous numbers of genuine horrific casualties in this war.
Absolutely.
And finally, you've got an example of a young Ukrainian woman who faked her own death in Bucha. What's this?
Right, now this is the layers of sort of disinformation, I suppose, because in this particular instance, it's kind of unclear why this woman juxtaposed an image of herself with a dead image. She gives an explanation. We'll just have to take it at face value. But in any case, here you can see an image of a woman by the name of Nastya, and an image where she shows herself lying down as a dead body in the street. Now, it claimed that there are several pro-Russian accounts. You can see this one here in French, claiming that that juxtaposition and her representation of herself as a dead woman, that this was shared online in a bid to participate in an operation generating fake news, right? That she was an actress in some way, shape or form. Now, if you find her Instagram account, she gives an explanation. She says, look, hello world. This particular juxtaposition got a lot of attention. My name is Nastya. I'm Ukrainian. My photos are on the left. This could have been any of us, raped, killed by Russians just for being Ukrainian. So she is claiming that she was doing this in order, in a bid to draw attention to the massacre. I suppose one of these sort of meme-like images that you can find on social media. Now, what gives a certain amount of credibility to that is she's not the only one. Here's a woman by the name of Yulia, also Ukrainian. She did the same thing. So it seems to be rather limited. It hasn't taken off in any wild form online, but a way of drawing attention to the massacre. This could have been any of us. So that's another example of how information or images are being misrepresented related to the Bucha massacre.
Yeah, well, you can see the Kremlin playbook at work. Working overtime, obviously, on
and just a reminder that you have to go to the reporting, listen to the reporters, listen to our reporters on the ground, because there's a huge amount of false information with an agenda swirling around on social media related to what's happening in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, they're trying to confuse and muddy the waters, as you said. Thank you so much, James Creedon. Thank you very much indeed. Up next, it's Focus, and 30 years since the start of the Bosnian War. We take a look back at some of the key events which have drawn some comparisons with recent events in Ukraine. That's today's Focus.
Sarajevo entre calme et guerre fantasmagorique.
You just can't imagine that tomorrow someone will bomb you or shoot at you.
C'est la loi de la guerre telle que la conçoivent les Serbes.
It was a scandal. It was practically a medieval siege. People were dying, just an hour and a half away from Paris.
Terrassés à genoux sur le macadam en plein cœur de Sarajevo.
If they shoot, they shoot. If you don't get past, you don't get past.
Alors on a appris à courir pour éviter les balles. Parfois l'on marche confiant, mais les fous ou les ennemis de la paix sur Sniper Avenue sont là pour rappeler à un peuple qu'il n'est pas le plus fort avec ses faux espoirs.
You could say we were naive. We thought we were going to stop all of this.
Created in 1945, the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was united by the will of a single man, Marshal Tito. After his death in 1980, the nationalists were reinvigorated. The fall of the Soviet Union accelerated their seizure of power. In 1991, Slovenia and then Croatia declared their independence.
It was like a house of cards that started to collapse.
We already felt after the election that things weren't right. But after Slovenia and Croatia, we still didn't think it would happen in Sarajevo.
The 6th of April, 1992. A demonstration bringing together thousands of people is held in Sarajevo. Croats, Bosniaks, Serbs, all calling for peace.
There were dozens and dozens of buses bringing people from every corner of Bosnia. We organised a big demonstration for peace. The result, the first victims.
From the roof of the Holiday Inn, Serbian nationalists opened fire on the crowd.
It was absolute panic. People were running in every direction. There were injuries. It was hell. Hell, hell.
Straight after the first bombardments, they started shooting everywhere. It wasn't just about killing people. For them, it was fun to destroy a civilization.
Serbian fighters settled for months on the hills overlooking Sarajevo, relentlessly shelling the city.
Sarajevo is a basin. It's about 6,000 meters in length and 2,000 meters wide. You have 250, 280,000 people there under siege. The city was defended, and the Serbs were never really trying to take it or get in. It was bombing, it was shooting, it was putting pressure on the Bosniaks to finish it with their surrender.
After the first summer, the siege is at a stalemate, and the bombardments become less frequent.
It wasn't every day. There were periods of ceasefire that were more or less respected, but it always ended up going wrong.
Before long, the besieged city is cut off from the outside world.
The phones went first. Fine. Then the electricity was cut off. We learned how to make candles. There's no more water. We learned how to do everything with just 5 liters of water, sometimes less.
All the trees in the city ended up as firewood. School books, too. It all became firewood because the winters can be harsh.
In July 1992, the UN set up an airlift to provide humanitarian aid. They were regularly targeted by the Serbs, and the UN paid a heavy price. 200 peacekeepers were killed in the former Yugoslavia, among them 84 French soldiers. 3 years passed, punctuated by bombardments and sniper fire. Every moment spent outside brought the risk of death. But it wasn't until the mortar attack on a busy market on the 5th of February 1994 that the horror of Sarajevo's torment became untenable for the international community. 68 people died, hundreds were wounded.
I was there a few minutes after it happened. It was truly carnage, slaughter. Especially when it's women and children. These weren't fighters. It was assassination, pure and simple. That's a war crime. There are no other words.
I often can't believe what happened there. It was a bad dream, something like that. But no, it's reality, and we have to live with that.
International pressure at that stage was not enough to make the Serbs lift their siege. Another year passed. It was only after the massacre of Srebrenica in the summer of 1995, when more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed in an act of ethnic cleansing, that peacekeepers received the order to liberate Sarajevo by force.
This time we were ready to fight, and we fought. A bombing campaign that lasted, what, 10 days? That's it. We ended this war in 10 days.
On the 29th of February 1996, after almost 4 years, the siege of Sarajevo was finally lifted. But the destruction and loss of life will forever weigh heavy on this city's inhabitants.
Well, that was today's edition of Focus. I'll be back at the top of the hour with the top stories. Don't go away.
Sri Lanka's civil war that ended in 2009 still marks the daily lives of the Tamil minority. They were the big losers in the conflict, and after all this time, many are still searching for those who disappeared.
A people
marginalised for more than 70 years, the Tamils cannot mourn their dead and are fighting to uncover the truth. Excavations of mass graves suggest the worst for families still hoping to find their loved ones and are damning for a government that remains silent.
இலங்கையில் 7 ரகசிய முகாம் இருக்குன்னு மன்னிப்பு சபை 2011ஆம் ஆண்டு நவம்பர் 10ல பத்திரிகையில வந்த செய்தி.
Don't miss Sri Lanka Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Join us every day here on France 24 for the last stretch of the presidential race, the mother of all election, the presidential election. This is the time for the French to choose their president. We'll have all our special envoys on the campaign trail across the globe, the latest analysis, the best polls. Join us here on France 24.
France 2022, the campaign on France 24 and France24.com.
This is live from Paris. It's 9 p.m. I'm Tom Burgess Watson, and these are the headlines. As Russia continues to pound the Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv and Mariupol, NATO holds talks to discuss next steps, and the UK and the US unveil fresh sanctions. Human rights groups accuse Ethiopian forces of committing abuses against the Tigrayan people. Abuses, they say, amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. A military court in Burkina Faso hands a life sentence to the former president, Blaise Compaoré, over the assassination of the revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara back in 1987. Welcome back. We begin on the ground in Ukraine, where Russian artillery has today continued to pound the city of Kharkiv in the northeast and the port city of Mariupol in the south. Well, the Ukrainian authorities say that Russia may soon launch a full-blown assault to try to take Kharkiv, which is the country's second largest city. Well, in Mariupol, the humanitarian situation is reported to be getting worse as tens of thousands of people remain trapped with very limited access to food, water or electricity. Well, since pulling back from areas surrounding Kyiv last week, Russian forces are shifting their assault towards the south and the east of the country. Well, meanwhile, it emerged today that Russian forces had struck a fuel depot close to the Ukrainian city of Dnipro overnight. That resulted in a huge blaze, which took 8 hours to extinguish. Well, Dnipro's airport was destroyed by Russian strikes last month. Well, France 24's chief foreign editor Rob Parsons is in the west of Ukraine, in the border city of Lviv, with the latest.
The Ukrainian government has been warning that that's going to happen for some time now. Western intelligence has also spoken of a redeployment of Russian troops away from the northwest of Kiev and from the east of Kiev to the east of the country, around the Donbass area, where it's assumed that the Russians are looking for a relatively easy victory in eastern Ukraine, that perhaps by Victory Day on May the 9th in Russia, Vladimir Putin will be able to trumpet a victory of sorts to the Russian people. But certainly today, the alarm bells seem to be ringing a bit louder in Ukraine. The deputy vice, or the vice premier warning, or urging rather, people living in the east of the country, in the Donbass, to evacuate as fast as possible. And today, you spoke about the rocket attacks, the artillery attacks on Kharkiv, but there were also attacks on the cities, the towns of the Donbass as well. Severodonetsk, for instance, in the northern part of Luhansk province, which is already largely taken by the Russians, was subjected to a pretty intensive artillery strike, some 10 multi-story buildings set on fire. And what the government is saying now is get out while you can, get out as fast as you can. This is the first time that the Ukrainian government has issued a warning like that, and one has to assume that what they've got in mind is what happened in those towns, those satellite towns around Kiev, like Bucha and Irpin, and they don't want to see the same thing happening again if Russian troops manage to move into those towns in Luhansk and Donetsk provinces.
France 24's Rob Parsons reporting there from Lviv. Meanwhile, NATO foreign ministers began 2 days of talks in Brussels today to discuss next steps regarding the situation in Ukraine. Well, NATO allies have supplied Ukraine with key weaponry, including anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, which have helped Ukrainian forces to push back the invading Russian troops. Well, the NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, said today that the conflict had reached what he called a critical phase as Moscow moves its forces out of the north and repositions them in the east of Ukraine for what's expected to be a major offensive. Well, Stoltenberg also said the conflict could last many months or even years, but he hailed the strength of the alliance and also the leadership that's being offered by the United States.
The US leadership has been outstanding and is indispensable. And that is of great importance when we face a very dangerous situation with the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I look forward to sit down with you, with the other foreign ministers in NATO, and to discuss a wide range of issues today and tomorrow, of course including Ukraine, but also that we are able to sit down with our Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Korea.
The NATO Secretary General speaking there. Well, he was standing beside the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And here's what he said about what Washington's goals are with regards to Ukraine.
We set out to do three things if Russia decided to pursue this horrific aggression against Ukraine. One was to support our Ukrainian partners. We're doing that. Two was to put extraordinary pressure on Russia. We're doing that. Three was to make sure that we were shoring up the defenses of our own alliance, NATO, and we're doing that. And today, tomorrow, we'll continue to talk about not only how we can sustain these efforts, but how we can build upon them.
Antony Blinken speaking there. Meanwhile, the US and the UK announced new sanctions today targeting Russia. These latest punitive measures will hit Russian financial institutions as well as Kremlin officials and their family members. Washington's measures include banning new Russian investment, sanctioning President Putin's adult children and family members of the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov. Meanwhile, the UK sanctioned 2 Russian banks and vowed to eliminate all Russian oil and gas imports by the end of the year. In other news, a military court in Burkina Faso has today handed down a life prison term to the country's former president, Blaise Compaoré, who was tried in absentia. This over the assassination of the revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara back in 1987. While applause erupted in the courtroom as the verdict was announced, bringing this 6-month-long trial to an end. Well, Compaoré, who was ousted in 2014, lives in exile in Ivory Coast. Well, France 24's Peter O'Brien has more.
Mariam Sankara, Thomas Sankara's widow, enters the courthouse in Ouagadougou, ahead of a verdict that she's been waiting for, along with millions of Burkinabés, for 34 years. A military tribunal has sentenced former President Blaise Compaoré to life in prison for facilitating the assassination of Sankara, his predecessor.
La vérité judiciaire vient nous édifier sur les responsabilités individuelles du président Compaoré, du général Diendéré et autres sur l'assassinat prémédité du capitaine Sankara et de ses collaborateurs.
Thomas Sankara remains to this day an iconic leader for his sweeping socialist reforms in Burkina Faso, a country which he himself renamed. In 1987, after just 3 years as president, he was killed along with 12 of his entourage. Aluna Traoré is the only survivor. In October, he said Sankara was murdered for loving his people.
Le procès ne pourra pas nous restaurer nos rêves. Nous avions rêvé de Burkina. Nous avions une idée de ce que pouvait être notre pays. Hommes valeureux, courageux, qui s'assument et qui assument leur destin.
Blaise Compaoré's lawyers had called it a political trial. Compaoré ruled for 27 years until his ouster in 2014 and was sentenced in absentia because he's in exile in Côte d'Ivoire. 10 others were also handed prison sentences for their involvement in the assassination, and 3 defendants were acquitted.
Now, according to 2 rights groups, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, security forces and their allies have committed abuses against the Tigrayan people in northern Ethiopia. Abuses, they say, amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Well, their joint report says that Tigrayan civilians have been relentlessly targeted since the outbreak of Ethiopia's war back in November 2020. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Jean-Baptiste Galopin, who is a researcher at Amnesty International. Welcome to you, Dr. Galopin.
Good evening.
Your joint investigation with Human Rights Watch, 220 pages in total. You carried this report out over a period of 15 months. Just tell us what kind of crimes are catalogued in that report.
What we found is that since the beginning of the conflict in November 2020, the forces, security forces and officials of the Amhara region, which is a region that neighbors Tigray and that is supporting the government in its conflict with the Tigrayan forces, that these officials have carried out ethnic cleansing against the civilian population of Tigrayans in Western Tigray. So Western Tigray is an area in the northwestern parts of Ethiopia that has been the site of a decades-long territorial dispute, and on the occasion of the conflict, the Amhara region seized control of that area. And within 2 weeks, the authorities began to carry out their ethnic cleansing using killings, mass and arbitrary detention, looting, sexual violence, and denial of humanitarian aid, as well as a regime of ethnically targeted restrictions against Tigrayans. Tigrayans were not allowed to speak their native language, Tigrinya. They were not allowed to move around, to farm their land, and eventually hundreds of thousands were forcibly removed from the area. Either they fled because they could not live there anymore, or because they were victims of violence, or they were actively expelled by Amhara security forces in roundups of tens of thousands. So their Tigrayans were loaded onto trucks, and that includes, women and children and older people and people with disabilities. The persecution really occurred in different phases, but the net was ever widening. At first, the arbitrary detention was primarily targeting men, and then subsequently women, children, older people were targeted as well. And the UN estimates that 29,000 people were displaced in just the latest wave in November. In total, it's hundreds of thousands, probably 600,000 or 700,000 people who were expelled from the area or forcibly displaced.
And when you look at, if we talk about responsibility, if you look at the chain of command, where does the buck stop? Does the chain of command, can you trace it back to the government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed?
Our research shows that the primary culprits for this ethnic cleansing campaign were the security officials as well as the civilian officials that were newly appointed to control the area and appointed by the Amhara region. We found that the Ethiopian federal military was complicit in some of these abuses and carried out war crimes, particularly during the initial offensive, with indiscriminate shelling of towns, as well as extrajudicial killings and looting. But the bulk of the ethnic cleansing was carried out by forces of the Amhara region. And these abuses amount to not only war crimes, but crimes against humanity, which are crimes that are widespread and systematic and committed with the intent to target the civilian population of Tigrayans in Western Tigray. Now, we're very concerned about the fate of what we believe thousands of Tigrayans still detained in these formal and informal detention sites around the town of Humera, particularly in appalling conditions where many die of denial of food, denial of treatment and torture, as well as extrajudicial executions. And so we're calling on the Ethiopian government to release those who are arbitrarily detained, to allow humanitarian organizations to access the area, as well as also we call on the government to allow media and human rights groups to access the area. And we want the government to disarm and demobilize the abusive militias, and as well as to remove from their positions the officials who are implicated in these abuses. Finally, we call on the